Hi, this is Tony Northrup for Train Signal, and in this video lesson for the SSCP certification exam, I'm going to discuss security awareness training, something you'll have to do to educate the users that you work for. So let's talk about why you have to do this security training. First and foremost, it's for compliance with laws and best practices and standards. So legally, basically. Of course, if there are regulations that impact your particular business, then you have to comply with those, and that often requires you to train users. When we say best practices, that can also be legal because, at least in the United States, but I suspect many other countries, there's this concept called legal negligence. And part of what defines negligence is complying with industry standards and best practices. So if there's a compromise that happens in your organization and some user credit cards are exposed to the world, well, if you've followed industry standard best practices, then you are much less likely to be considered liable for damages. Now, if you haven't been following best practices, which might include training your employees not to give out credit card numbers over the phone, for example, well, the odds of you being considered liable and the amount you might be liable for are going to be much higher. So a big part of the reason that you do the security training is just to cover yourself in case something bad does happen. But of course, the primary purpose is to prevent that from happening in the first place. Now, it's important in security training to not just throw information at people and tell them do this and don't do this. You want them to understand the rationale behind your policies. For example, if you decide that exposing information to social networking is too great of a risk, you might tell users no Facebook. But if that's it, if you just say no Facebook, well, they're going to think, oh, my company is so stupid, I'm just going to sneak on Facebook here on my cell phone. They'll find a way to work around it. On the other hand, if you make them understand the risks that they might be taking by social networking at work, that they might expose some tiny detail of work and that people really are watching their public profiles, well, they're much more likely to comply. They'll also buy in. So most people are very capable of understanding the reasoning behind security regulations. You just need to give them that information. Many of your security guidelines are going to inconvenience the user in some way. So it's really important to accept the feedback from the user experience and let them know that you're listening and that you understand it. For example, if you work in a high security organization, you have to take away everybody's cell phones. Well, you're going to have people saying, but that's where the school calls me when my kid gets sick. I need my cell phone. And the proper response to that is to say, okay, I understand, and that's a very valid concern. Unfortunately, we have to follow these security regulations that are defined by groups of people and not just me individually. And I will raise your concern. So that's a good way to handle the types of problems that are going to come up. At the end of this slide, I list several different ways you can present security policy training. So on-the-job training means that while they're performing a job, you kind of stand over their shoulder and give them guidance, or whoever their manager is might give them that sort of guidance. Mandatory meetings, of course, everybody hates it, but it allows you to train a group of people at the same time, and the classroom environment is very similar to that. The last two items on that list are online and CBT, which is computer-based training, and I guess you already know a little bit about how effective that can be, right? Well, there are lots of online and computer-based training courses designed for the end users to familiarize them with security best practices. Because this is such a personal thing for organizations, the rules that you follow need to be catered specifically to your requirements. Often you end up making your own computer-based training, but you can get canned computer-based training and online courses that you can either build off of or use piecemeal to create the course that best suits your organization. So this dramatic poster is from World War II. It's an American poster that they created to help reduce the risk of people kind of sharing information about military actions. And I'm putting it in here because it's a form of end-user security training, and it conveys a lot of what's important in security training. So the caption is 6 words: a careless word, a needless sinking. And then this really vivid imagery. And I really respect this poster because it communicates an important concept in the simplest possible way with the fewest number of words and the most vivid visual imagery possible. And that's the most effective way to communicate. I see so many people, both security and not, write paragraph after paragraph after paragraph in some long email. Nobody's going to read it. Look, I've written 32 books, and most of them are well over 600 pages. Some of them are over 8,000 pages. So there's nobody in the world wordier than me. But in the modern era, when you need to communicate something, you need to do it as concisely and simply as possible, and you need to use as much imagery as possible. So throughout this course, I'm going to be showing you different posters, and I want you to think about how they convey it and how you can apply those styles to your modern day security training. One of the concepts that you're going to need to communicate is threat awareness. Unfortunately, security training isn't something you can do once and then forget about it. It's an ongoing process because security is constantly evolving. There are always new threats. Look, it keeps us in a job, right? But it means you can't ever be lazy, and you have to continually communicate about the latest threats that are coming out. Sometimes, especially during a zero-day exploit, you need to send an email out immediately to everybody in the company to make them aware. Fortunately, these things only happen a couple of times a year. A zero-day exploit means that the same day the vulnerability is made public, there's an exploit available. So vulnerability is a hole in a piece of software that some hacker or piece of malware could exploit to, say, elevate privileges or gain access to confidential information. It's called a zero-day exploit because most exploits take 30 days or 6 months after the vulnerability is discovered for a hacker to put together an exploit that takes advantage of it. Well, if you discover the vulnerability and an exploit at the same time, then the software manufacturer doesn't have an opportunity to patch it. Therefore, you need to find a workaround, another way to mitigate the risk of that vulnerability. Sometimes it means changing your firewall rules. Sometimes it means communicating to your end users not to do something, not to visit a particular website that might be carrying malware, for example. While zero-day exploits often require an immediate communication to end users, most problems, you can just keep them updated on a regular basis. So a lot of security organizations within enterprises will send out monthly emails that just summarize the new things that have happened and kind of give a tip or two to remind users of the security awareness training that they've already been through. Often instead of an email, it'll just be posted somewhere on the internet. You might grab a little corner of screen space on the cafeteria menu or some other page that users visit regularly with a concise tip or something like the poster that I showed you. Some of the topics that you want to regularly communicate to users would include things like phishing attacks. You could remind them not to click on links in emails or instant messages. Remind them about social engineering tactics, like don't give out your password or credit card number over the phone. And of course, to remind them about new viruses that appear and the importance of keeping their home computers patched and updated, and maybe even a link to instructions on how to set up automatic updates. Here's a more modern security awareness poster. It's a Beware of Phishing poster. It's put out by quietmint.com, and it's free. So they have a bunch of posters you can go grab, and I'll show you a couple more as we go through the slides. This has a few more words. In fact, it has so many words on there that I would think they could maybe make it a little tighter. But even the writing that they have here is very concise. It's to the point, and if somebody was in an elevator, they might be inclined to read the whole thing. Again, we have a catchy visual at the top, which will get somebody's attention. It's striking and unusual, and it's a familiar sign. Looks like a yield sign in traffic, but yet it's unfamiliar, and that is going to key their brain to look a little bit further and try to explain why somebody's pulling a dude out of a river with a laptop computer. Of course, then they'll read the Beware of Phishing title. And phishing's not spelled the way that they're familiar with, and so this all kind of lures them into reading the meat of the message. Don't click on links in emails that ask for personal information. Never open unexpected attachments. Delete suspicious messages. These are core concepts that will protect a lot of people, and it's communicated in a simple and straightforward way. Good poster. Let's talk about what you need to communicate about physical security, because end users are often exploited to bypass physical security. I've even done it just as an exercise at my own companies. You know what you can do is somebody will be smoking outside the door, and you just wait for them, light up a cigarette. You don't even need to smoke. It's just a good excuse to hang out there until they get ready to go outside. So light up a cigarette, hang out. When they put their cigarette out, you put their cigarette out. They scan their badge and get through the security and hold the door open for you. It's that easy. They will literally hold the door open and you can just walk right in. When I've done this in the past, nobody ever brings it up to me. Nobody ever says, hey, where's your badge? They don't need to know me. Most people aren't confrontational. So one of the things you need to train people is it's okay to be confrontational. In fact, other people will appreciate it. So encourage people to look for their IDs. And in fact, it's better not to simply visually verify that they have an ID. But if you have to scan your badge to open a door, close the door behind you and make them scan it. You can say, do you mind if I close the door behind me just so you can scan your badge when you come in? And do that. Now, a clever attacker will pat himself down and be like, oh, sure, you know what? I left my badge in my office. And the response to that, of course, is just go to the front desk. There's a security guard there. They'll look you up and they'll give you a guest pass to get through to your office. But don't hold the door to let people in. Other concepts you need to communicate about physical security are to report unusual activity. You know that weird guy who's like hanging out in the parking lot? Yeah. Go to the front desk and say, hey, there's a weird dude in the parking lot. I don't know what he was doing there. Maybe you just hired a weird contractor. Look, he could be a developer. Those guys always look a little strange, right? I say that because I was a developer for 20 years. So you see that weird guy hanging out, tell the front desk and tell your employees to do that too. This isn't true for every organization, but for many organizations, you only want people to use authorized computers. A lot of organizations will allow people to log in from home, but unauthorized computers carry a lot of risks. You know, if you let somebody log in with their own PC, you don't know if it has a rootkit or not. You couldn't detect it even if you required them to run malware. You don't know if it has a physical keyboard logger, and if it does, well, it's going to read their username and password, and whoever is accessing the keyboard logger is going to be able to use their credentials from that point forward. You should also educate people not to set up your own Wi-Fi. And this is physical security because a lot of organizations rely on physical security to protect their physical network. In other words, there's no inherent security in their wired Ethernet network. They just make sure that you can only connect your PC to the wired network from inside the building, and they protect the boundaries of the building. Therefore, if only legit users can get into the building, then only legit users can connect to the physical network, right? Well, you know what people do? They bring a Linksys router from home and they plug it in. And that way they can get Wi-Fi access. Sometimes they don't like the company Wi-Fi, or maybe the company doesn't provide Wi-Fi. They plug in their own router. It's easy as can be. Well, these things, they have default passwords or they have no password. And therefore, once they plug in that Wi-Fi, anybody who can send and receive radio signals to that Wi-Fi access point can bypass all your physical security and get to your wired Ethernet network and potentially get to other computers on the network and get to your data and your servers. And that's really dangerous. So tell people not to set up their own Wi-Fi and then later go back and audit and try to find their Wi-Fi access points. We'll talk about that in a different lesson. If you have to enter a PIN code in to, for example, get through the security desk, maybe it's a dual factor authentication technique where you scan your ID card at a door and then enter in a PIN. Well, cover your hand. Easy enough, right? But people don't do this, and you can shoulder surf it. Again, as a security practice, just see if you can tell the numbers that somebody types, because it's pretty easy. And then once you know the numbers that they type, well, you've defeated at least one factor of their authentication. And if they have dual factor, then you just need to grab an ID. And finally, lock your office and computer, even when you're in your company's facilities. Because you don't really trust your coworkers, do you? There are some bad seeds in there. They could sneak in your desk. They could attach a keyboard logger to your computer, and you'd probably never notice. They could install some software if your computer isn't locked. They could go through your files. They could plant a listening device in your office. It's not just for spies. That happens. They could also plant a little video recorder and watch what you're doing. So unless you either completely trust every one of your coworkers or nothing confidential happens in your office or on your computers, then you need to lock that. Physical security. Here's another American World War II poster, and I almost didn't include it because at first it strikes me as a little sexist, and then when I thought about it more, I realized they were actually trying to combat an inherent sexism that existed in this period during the 40s. The caption, "Keep Mum, She's Not So Dumb," is trying to combat the predisposition that military people had towards just spilling secrets to any pretty gal who might make conversation with them. Because at that point in our history, it wasn't common for women to be involved in the military. So they would assume that any random person didn't have any particular interest in whether they were going to be stationed in Belgium or Hawaii, or if they were being sent out on a submarine, or whatever sort of detail was going on. In the modern day, this really means don't tell people around you secrets. In another lesson, I told the story of how my dad, an engineer for government contractors, never told me what he did during the day until I was like in my late teens or early 20s, because he was always working on something confidential and he didn't even trust his 9-year-old son to hear it. And if you respect confidentiality, you do that too. And you don't tell your spouse, because you know what? Your spouse might not have the same respect for the confidentiality of it. They might bring up important details and mention them in passing to somebody else, and they might post something about it on Facebook, and just why would you burden them with that? Why would you give them the opportunity to ruin something important? And if you work for a really high security company, like, say, the military, well, people will actually befriend your spouse in an effort to get information from them about your day-to-day job. Spies will do that. So you can remove them from a dangerous place by simply not giving any information to them. Let's talk about how security awareness training can help you comply with different regulations. Hipaa, H-I-P-A-A, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, requires that patients' health information be really carefully protected because, well, frankly, there's been some privacy invasions in the past where people's health information got out, and maybe their insurance company didn't want to cover them when they found out bad things. Well, Hipaa has a lot of regulations, and for good reason. And if one of your employees isn't properly trained and they happen to mention over the phone that a particular customer of yours is in the hospital for some particular condition, well, that could lead to a lot of fines and liability for you. So it's important to train your employees about that. PCI DSS, the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, is designed to ensure that all companies that process, store, or transmit credit card information maintain a secure environment. So you need to look over these regulations and make sure that your employees are informed what they need to do to protect that credit card information. Even better, don't store that credit card information. I understand you still have to receive it and process it to handle a payment, but don't put it in a database. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act, SOX, mandates strict reporting requirements and internal controls of financial information. So there's a lot of detail here, and the SSCP exam is designed to work equally well in any country. So you're not going to see the specifics of any particular regulation, but I want you to be aware of the wide range of regulations that exist and make you kind of keep an eye out for them. So if you're in an industry that's impacted by one of these, take a look at it and factor that in when you're doing security awareness training. Another American World War II poster, and as you can see, this isn't targeted to the military personnel. It's actually targeted to their friends and family and spouses, perhaps. If you tell where he's going, he may never get there. So this was a real security concern. These military personnel would tell their spouse as they kiss them goodbye, "All right, I'm shipping out. We're going out to Guam." And guess what? That's revealing confidential information. This can get around, and opposing governments certainly had spies that were listening for this type of information. In the modern day era, it's even easier because people just put it on Facebook. So this is actually trying to communicate to spouses and friends. So this is actually kind of a belt and suspenders security protection. Of course, they informed this handsome Navy fellow, don't tell your spouse where you're going. But he did it anyway. Maybe he wanted to impress his lady friend, or maybe he just slipped up and just wanted her to know what he was going to be doing. Either way, he shouldn't have done it. So this poster trying to add another level of protection and communicating to the spouses, look, okay, he screwed up, he told you, don't tell anybody else, let it end there. The poster itself is effective because it's a handsome fellow with eye contact, there's action going on, he's got direction, and then it uses very few words, but they're emotional and impactful, and they make it known that the consequences are potentially dire even for a simple action. So I really like this poster, communicates a deep and important concept in very few words, and it attaches emotions to it, which will help people remember. Personally identifiable information. This is a big part of Hipaa, but it's an important concept for many different regulations and for businesses in general. PII is any information that can be used to identify an individual, your social security number in the United States, your birth date, your address, biometric information that might have been scanned in, such as fingerprints or your retina scans. Also, any information linked to an individual, such as their financial information or employee file or medical records. Basically, you want to communicate to employees that they want to keep their own PII as quiet as they can, and they really need to respect other people's PII and don't give out information about other people. If somebody dials the wrong number and they're like, hey, is Jane there? You shouldn't look up Jane's phone number. They'll even trick you into, say, giving out Jane's last name or maybe Mr. Jones's first name. A clever social engineer can use these same tactics to get lots of PII about the employees in your organization, and you'll feel like you're actually helping them out, but you'll be giving away their name and their phone number and their office number and the name of their assistant and maybe even their spouse's names or their kids' names. They can trick you into doing all of this, so you need to inform the people in your organization not to give any information out. Always refer them through to the directory or some other source that has been adequately protected. There are a couple of different consequences, and some of them are to the organization. Sometimes social engineers will use these tactics to get somebody's phone number just so they can recruit them away. Headhunters do that all the time. They're tricky, and while we don't think of headhunters as being the traditional attacker that we're afraid of, they're out there. And they'll steal your employees, and that'll cost your company a lot. Identity theft is another major threat, and with identity theft, somebody will gather up enough personally identifiable information about somebody to allow them to, say, order a new credit card for the person, change their address, take out a loan in their name, maybe even take out a mortgage or buy a car. Once you get enough information like the social security number, the address, the name of their parents, the name of their spouse, you can start getting into their other accounts, and you can do some really dangerous stuff. And it can really mess up the life of the person whose identity is stolen. So I want you to educate your users on the regulatory policies and procedures that your organization has concerning PII. And a good way to make this real and emotional for them are to show them examples of PII breaches in the news and to discuss the latest scams that target PII, such as various identity theft scams and the tactics that social engineers might use to get little bits and pieces of information out of them. Social networking, so scary in the modern era. Earlier when I was discussing the poster, I was talking about how simply mentioning that somebody was being stationed at a particular base could give important information to the enemy. And this happens in the modern world too. If there's a group of employees that are going off to meet with a company that they might merge with, well, all they need is one of those employees to check in at a competitor's office, and that can clue somebody in that there's some sort of communications going on between these two companies, and there might be a merger coming. Well, what happens then? Well, a competing company might decide to jump in and make a counteroffer and steal the deal away. Somebody might decide to buy or sell the stock of one of those organizations, performing insider trading, perhaps making a profit and stealing that profit from somebody else, but definitely breaking the law. So even the most simple things that you might mention can give away really important and confidential information, and you need to train your users to be aware of that. They should also be aware that there are lots of scams going on social networking sites, and Facebook in particular. There's malware that goes on, there's all sorts of phishing attacks, and these attacks can get your password and get other information out of you. And once they have that, it makes it much easier for them to get into your corporate network too. Also be aware that shortened URLs, especially on Twitter, have become really common, and these short URLs don't give you any clue about the destination URL, so it's kind of scary. It used to be if you were going to click on a link, you could look at the link and say, oh, this is going to Amazon. Amazon is a site that I trust. I'm okay with clicking that link. Nowadays, you look at a link and it's bit.ly/ and then some garbage, and you have no idea if it's taking you to a legit site or a malware site. So make users aware that when they click these links, well, they shouldn't necessarily trust it. So I don't actually know when this is from, but I have to assume that it's from the mid-90s because it looks pretty old. But it says, careful what you put on the web, and the web wasn't really in any sort of common use until, well, the early 90s, I guess. I guess I first logged into it in like 91 or 92. But this is the oldest example I could find of a poster that was trying to communicate, just be careful what you do on the internet because you give away the wrong piece of information and anybody anywhere can find it and potentially abuse it. Peer-to-peer file sharing. It's pretty common. Now, the term peer-to-peer file sharing just means that two users are exchanging a file directly without storing it on some sort of server. And that sounds just fine. After all, users communicate directly all the time. So why do we have to tell people not to trade files with other people? Well, because peer-to-peer file sharing really refers to larger networks where you exchange files with anonymous people. It's really not a problem if you're exchanging a file with Dave down the hall and you trust Dave. But if you're going on BitTorrent sites and you're searching amongst the millions of different files that they have indexed, well, you have no idea what you're getting. So here's a common scenario, and I certainly don't endorse this because it would involve piracy, but imagine somebody's out there looking for a pirated movie because they're too cheap to spend $10 on a movie or $3 to rent it. They download the movie file and get the file and they double click on it. Movie doesn't seem to work. Well, what happens a lot of the time is they didn't actually download a movie file. They downloaded a Trojan horse. It looks like a movie, but it's actually installing some malware on their computer. And this is rampant on peer-to-peer file sharing sites. And I've done some auditing, and I think it's fair to say that most of the files that you find on peer-to-peer sites are malware or some sort of illegitimate file. Most of them. So use your firewalls, hardware and software, and block all sorts of peer-to-peer file sharing. Block those websites that index those BitTorrents, and train your users on the dangers of it. Tell them what I told you. Most of these sites are bogus, and even if you're aware of that, it's real easy to accidentally click something. And once you click it, your computer could be messed up forever. You can get a rootkit that you can't remove. You can't remove, not even by formatting a drive. It's possible, and it happens. It really happens. And if that software somehow gets into your corporate network, it can spread really quickly from one PC to another. So when a user visits a peer-to-peer file sharing site or they exchange files with BitTorrent, they're not just risking their own data and identity, they're risking your entire corporate network. User habits are a big one because poor user habits lead to an awful lot of compromises. So we've talked about passwords in other lessons, but you know the drill. Don't use dictionary words, don't use your dog's name, don't use the same password for multiple accounts. Clean desk policies, that's pretty self-explanatory. Keep your desk clean. Now, not only is it tidy, but it forces you to put away confidential papers. If your desk is genuinely clean, it means you're not just going to forget some confidential bill or agreement or document on your desktop, and it also means that you're less likely to write your password on a Post-it note because you'll see it there. So have a clearly stated policy and have users read it and sign it. And then just have bosses kick users a little bit and tell them to clean their desk up once in a while. So this poster uses a bit of innuendo to kind of get people's attention. It says length does matter. And then it lectures them to create long passwords. Now, I personally don't necessarily agree with the specific content of the poster, though I do like the format of it and I like the way that it gets attention and kind of urges you to read the rest of it. Me personally, I think Passphrases are a passing phase. I think as soon as they get popular, these passphrases will be integrated into password dictionaries. So I think a passphrase is actually exercising a bit of security by obscurity, which I'm not a fan of. I'd much rather see people use conventional passwords. Also, because so many people now are logging in with touchscreen devices like cell phones, where typing a 14-character password would feel really cumbersome, I think it starts to become too difficult for users to manage. Some more information about user habits and data handling. Now, confidential data needs to be encrypted before you transport it in any way. If you put it on a USB flash drive, it should be encrypted because you can lose that flash drive. If you are going to email it to somebody, it should be encrypted because you don't know what that person's email is like. You don't know if they keep their password secure, if other people have their account, or if they leave their email logged in on public computers. You don't know. So encrypt these files and don't send the password with the file, okay? Send it through a different mechanism. Don't even send the password in an email and then send the encrypted file in a different email. Text them the password if you have to, and then email them the attachment, or call them and tell them the password, or better yet, text them half the password and call them and tell them the other half of the password. That way, for somebody to collect the whole password, they have to be listening through multiple channels and then gain access to the actual file in email. Store files in the appropriate place on the network. What usually happens is companies will put together file servers and users are supposed to store files there. But they often are just lazy and they'll just save it in their local documents folder, which might not have the appropriate security measures attached to it. Therefore, they're reducing the security levels of the documents on their network. Just tell them to store it where they're supposed to and reinforce where they're supposed to store it and remind them on a regular basis. Printouts and faxes are the worst because, well, everybody hates hard copies, right? But you'll print out some confidential document and, you know it's going to take like a couple of minutes to print. Sometimes there's another dozen jobs in front of yours and you just have to wait. And by then, well, you've gotten coffee and you've forgotten what you were working on in the first place, and your confidential paper sits there on the printer for days. And it gets pushed around, and everybody sees it. And I've seen confidential stuff printed out and left sitting on the printer, so don't do that. Same thing with faxes. If somebody faxes you something, make sure they call you so you can go fetch it off the fax machine. Better yet, it's like 2013. Get rid of the faxes already. That's like a 1970s technology. Have them scan it and email it to you. I should say scan it, encrypt it, and email it to you. Properly label and dispose of data. That just means that confidential data should be labeled confidentially and handled appropriately. And by disposing of data, we mean shred your documents, securely delete files. Don't just put them in the recycle bin, but delete them and then overwrite the file if it's really confidential. And don't share your credentials or ID badges with anybody. This happens all the time too. Somebody's ID badge won't work. I worked at a company where about every 2 weeks my ID badge would just stop working for no good reason, probably because I was putting it in my pocket and breaking it. But because of this, I would just keep borrowing other people's ID badges whenever I had to leave the office and come back in. And they shouldn't have done that. I shouldn't have done that. But tell your users not to do that, because then you lose the ability to audit, right? So if I borrow Mary's card and I go get a cup of coffee and I come back in the office, well, I'm scanning in as Mary. Now, that doesn't sound too bad until there's a break-in or something and they try to figure out everybody who's come and gone from the office, and they'll think that Mary came in when she really didn't. So suddenly if people are loaning out badges, then you have no idea who's coming and going from your facilities. Some safe computing tips to communicate. Tell users not to communicate to unprotected wireless networks that they don't trust. And if they are going to, don't use it for anything confidential. People can sniff your traffic. If the Wi-Fi network isn't protected with a password, anybody can read your traffic. And even if it is protected with a password, whoever manages that access point, they can read all your traffic. And we've kind of covered the last couple of points already, but spoofing and phishing, teach users to be aware of those things. Use HTTPS and check the spelling of the URL that they're visiting. Don't click on links in emails. And anytime you download a file or attachment, just be aware that it could be anything. And they should investigate it really closely. They should check the file extension. They should be sure not to run anything with administrative privileges, and to open files by opening up the application first and then opening up the file rather than simply double-clicking files from File Explorer. Here's another security poster that conveys some of those same thoughts in a very visual way. Even without the words, you can tell what's going on. It's the international symbol for Wi-Fi, and the magnifying glass is revealing some confidential information like the date of birth, password, salaries, bank accounts. And then just connect with care, followed by 2 sentences that concisely convey the idea. So I know I'm the wrong person to be telling you not to be wordy because you've been listening to hours and hours of me rambling on, but really be as concise as you can and you'll communicate more effectively. Another element of user habits that you need to train are about personally owned devices, because nowadays everybody has their tablets and their own PCs and their smartphones. It's called BYOD. It even has its own acronym now, Bring Your Own Device. So the most secure thing for you to do is to not allow any personal devices, because they could contain proprietary data. People will copy stuff to them. They can get malware infections and then spread them to your internal network. But realistically, how are you going to take everybody's smartphones away? Not many organizations can do that. Really, it's only like government and military organizations that can. The rest of these private companies have to kind of find a way to accommodate the technology that people use and need in many cases. So if you decide to allow these devices, it's important to have an acceptable use policy that tells users what they can and can't do with them. Maybe you allow them to connect to the network, or maybe you don't. Maybe you keep it entirely separate. Maybe you allow them to connect to social networks while they're at work, or maybe you don't. Maybe you allow them to log into the corporate internet from their iPhone, or maybe you don't. So you need to assess the risks of all of these different things and then communicate clearly to the users what they can and can't do. This is Tony Northrup for Train Signal, and thanks so much for watching this video lesson.